Okay, so the next overall topic, social issues and community leaders. And we're going to start with the land of your people, Honduras. So we, in Honduras, of course, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, I think it is the biggest issue, social issue is the discussion of land rights.
Yeah.
So what were the effects of the disappearances and murders of all these activists and land defenders in the Garifuna community, especially with activists like Miriam Miranda? And how is this issue rooted in anti-blackness? Because
So a couple of things come to mind, right? I mean, I think, yes, land is, when we think about the context of Garifuna communities in Central America's Caribbean coasts, right, from Belize all the way to Nicaragua, land is the issue, right? Land is the political terrain, it's the landscape, it's the struggle. And part of the struggle with land is that Garifuna folks are making an important intervention into who does the nation state gets to claim as indigenous? Where does the nation state locate its indigeneity? And part of that, part of it has been really successful, right? Part of it is like people of African descent are still not seen as indigenous to the Americas, despite the fact of surviving the horrors of the Middle Passage and then literally cultivating the democratic soil that we all live and stand on, right? And that has everything to do with the transatlantic slave trade, right? People of African descent are not seen as indigenous to the Americas because of chattel slavery. They were seen as property. And, if we're really going to take seriously the work of Saidiya Hartman, right? Black people never stopped being property, right? The emancipation happens, right? But the ideological basis of slavery is still intact. So this is why in 2023, right, Black Lives Matter has to be uttered in every breath, because the ontological impossibility of Black people being indigenous to the Americas is because we understand Blackness in the Americas is grounded and rooted in chattel slavery. So Garifuna folks have actually done a really good job in doing a couple of things. They've done a really good job of using their shipwrecked slaves narrative as a distinction from plantation life, but they've also used the invocation of indigeneity really wisely, right? They've used it in a way to say that their Arawak Carib heritage and lineage is who they are, right? Is what their culture is. It's what their people are. So part of this project of Garifuna indigeneity is that they're also, this is why St. Vincent is such an important ancestral homeland, right? Because part of the ancestral homeland of St. Vincent is that it holds indigeneity, right? St. Vincent is the beholder of indigeneity for Garifuna folks, right? And part of that beholding of indigeneity is one that has to be invoked because the corporal realities of Garifuna folks, the state only interprets and racializes Garifuna folks as people of African descent, right? And part of that dance, and Garifuna folks were actually, and most people don't know this, but Garifuna folks were the first and thus far only Black indigenous community in Latin America to get land titles, right? Which is different from land rights, right? They got land titles and tenure, but they didn't get land rights. Land rights are still a struggle, right? The state can come in at any moment and take their ancestral lands, right? Which is very tricky. But part of that struggle, Miriam Miranda is huge on this, right? Because one of her huge critiques about the land struggle and activism in Honduras is that, Honduras is a narco state. So that means that the port of entries for drug trafficking are all infused in Garifuna communities, right? So all of that, right? All of the Caribbean coast of Central America is inundated with drug trafficking, right? It's a port of entry. So Garifuna folks feel not only the violence of that economy, right? But they also have no other choice but to eventually participate in that economy, right? Because then what's also happening is land dispossession is happening, land displacement is happening, and so is work displacements, right? The state comes in with foreign capital, builds these massive resorts, and don't hire locals, right? They'll bring mestizos from other parts of the country to come work, and it's like, don't you see all these people here not working and could really this check? So yeah, it's one of those tricky things where I think land continues to be really, really important. And, you know, you had mentioned in your question about like these land activists disappearing, you know, I think it was five Garifuna men that got disappeared from El Triunfo de la Cruz back in the summer of George Floyd. Oh crap. Back in the summer of George Floyd, you have this disappearance, right? And you have this disappearance of 5 Garifuna men from El Triunfo de la Cruz, which is a very well-known Garifuna community on the Caribbean coast of Honduras. It's located right between San Pedro Sula and La Ceiba. It's a middle point. And part of the activism there is that they got disappeared, but a lot of the public discourse is like, oh, well, they were caught up in drugs, or this was not really a land thing. This was more of a narco thing. And I think a lot of folks ultimately, I mean, I'm under the impression it's a combo of both, right? Like, I think the reality of the Caribbean coast of Central America is that if it's a narco state, and if the state itself is allowing for drug trafficking in really complicated ways, and there's no economy around locally, yeah, folks are going to have to participate. There's no other option. That's the only source of income that's possible there, right? So I think there was a combination of both. I think also it's not a coincidence that all 5 of them were folks really heavily involved in like land struggles, land issues, right? I think that's very much embedded. I also think the state wants to make it a narco thing, right? So the hyper criminalization of Black people, right? So this can be another example of like, yep, of course they were involved in drug stuff. They're Black, right? Yeah. And the state can make these allegations, make these kind of, you know, stigmatizations, continued stigmatizations. So it's an interesting moment to kind of think about land, because part of my work is also to think about, well, what does Garifuna land look like in the United States, right? What does it look like in New York City, where there isn't ancestral lands, right? Or at least not the physicality of ancestral lands.